I studied English for nearly 15 years through primary school, high school, college, and so on, but I just couldn't speak the language. Does it ring a bell when it comes to your French, Spanish, or German journey, or whatever the language? However, now I'm fluent in the language. And what do I mean by fluency? What I mean is I feel totally comfortable using the language in any situation. I'm still going to make mistakes here and there. That's just part of the process. But like I said, I feel totally comfortable using the language in any situation. That's what I mean by fluency. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about what I did in order to get there without even being aware of it for the most part, to be honest. And also, I'm going to talk about what I didn't do, or rather what I stopped doing, to be honest. So let's get into it. So I started learning English when I was 5. And throughout primary school, middle school, high school, like I said, I studied English for 2, 3 hours a week until I was 18, until I went to college. And I'll talk about the specific number of hours later to talk about how inefficient that is. But I vividly remember, like, when I was 18, like being able to pass any grammar exam, but just completely unable to speak the language. And I'll talk about a specific example in a moment. And then I had a couple of subjects in English in college as well. Like I studied economics and I had a couple of subjects. But I still remember being 21, if I'm not mistaken, and being in a situation in which I wanted to talk to a international student from France that came to my city on an Erasmus program in Europe, like an exchange program for a year. And I perfectly remember like just being completely unable to, get my point across, talk about whatever I wanted to talk about, like get my thoughts together, if you may, right? And well, I just remember the frustration I felt in that moment. I just had to give up on that conversation, like literally. And why did that happen? So it happened because, I tried to learn the language the traditional way, the way most people try to learn a foreign language, unfortunately. And that's just not the way it works. It's just not the way the language mechanism works in our brain. That's not how we all learn our native languages. And again, I'm not saying we should learn the language exactly the same way as kids do, but the principles have to be the same, right? Like the main ideas. So, like I said, I just couldn't speak the language, and it's just, grammar exercises and drills and memorizing vocabulary lists and so on. That's just not the way it works. Fortunately, to be honest, because, if I had to learn a foreign language that way, I would have given up a month as an adult later on, right? But I had to because I was a kid going to school, high school, and so on. But like I said before, I just couldn't speak the language, and I'm pretty sure that's the case for what 95, 99% of people going through that same educational period, right? And as I'd even say that for those that did work, it didn't work because of those classes, but because what they did afterwards, or the music they listened to, or things like that. You know. And to get a bit into the numbers, so if I studied English for 13 years, I'm not even going to talk about those subjects I had in college, like 8.5 to 8.18, 13 years. Assuming I had English for 35 to 40 weeks a year, like 52 weeks in a year, excluding holidays and so on. So that's around 70 to 80 hours per year, right? Assuming I only had 2 classes per year, because like I said, it was 2, 3 classes depending on the year, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, even like the lowest possible number, which is like 35 times 270 times 13, that's over 900 hours of classes. And, if you get 900 hours of classes, I'd say that's a number that should give you better results, right? And, I'm just trying to imagine having as many classes with an efficient method, right? I would have learned English or any language. It's just so many classes, so much time listening to the language if you do it the right way, of course, which I didn't, like most people do, right? Or most people don't, I mean. So, like I said, that led to just not being able to communicate in the language. It led to having to think about everything that I wanted to say, to try to assemble the sentences together, trying to remember the lessons, trying to remember the grammar rules so I could apply them in real time, which is not a good idea, as you may know, right? And yeah, I just couldn't speak the language. I've said it 5, 6 times, but I perfectly remember that feeling. Is being completely unable to build the sentences, to hold a conversation, to get my point across, like I said. But soon everything changed, and that's without me being aware of it, like I said, right? So that's the funny part. Like I realized what I did afterwards, in hindsight, right? But what changed is I started watching the NBA, like NBA basketball in English, around that time when I was 21, 20, 21, right? And I started doing it because I like the sport. I'd already been doing that for a couple of years in Spanish, but I decided to give it a try in English for several reasons. First of all, it was just the native language of the sport, meaning I was watching American basketball, right? So it just felt right to try to listen to it in the language, in English, right? And then, always on the back of my mind, I kind of had a hope that it was going to work out, right? That it was a good idea. But the main point here is I started doing it because I enjoyed it, because I loved the sport. I loved watching it. And after all those years, at least my comprehension was good enough to be able to understand what was going on. Obviously, with a huge room for improvement, right? Even in and comprehension ability, I mean, in speaking ability, all the room in the world for improvement, right? But like I said, my understanding, my comprehension was good enough to be able to understand what was going on. And I've talked about it several times, but to be quick here, there's a lot of power in watching sports or similar things in a foreign language because, like I said, my comprehension was good enough, right? But there's a great thing about sports in this case. You can replicate it with other things, but I talk about sports. Is that as you're listening to the commentators, you're seeing the action live at the same time, right? So you're listening to what they're saying, and you're seeing the action at the same time. That means it's way easier to connect the ideas, right? So I don't know, to give quick examples, if the commentator said LeBron James with the fadeaway, I had no idea what a fadeaway was. But when I heard the commentator talk about it many times and I saw the action at the same time, I was able to make the connection way faster, right? Because I saw it live. Or dunking the basketball. I didn't know how to say that in English, but I saw it, So that's a great thing about sports. Like, one, it helps you make those connections faster, like I said. And two, for the most part, people who watch sports do it because they love it, right? So it's a great source if you're looking to learn a foreign language, right? If you can find a way to watch your favorite sports, of course. Now, without me being aware of it, like I said, I would realize later on down the road, that was my first contact with the idea of comprehensible input, meaning understanding what I'm listening to or reading, simply put. So I continued to do that, for 3-4 more years. And, I listened to English a lot. Like, I don't know. I would watch 1 to 2 games every day because there's, from October to June, there are NBA games every day, right? Or mostly every day. So I would listen to 2 3 hours of English every day, which is a lot, you know. And fast forward to the year I became 24, I talk a little bit about what I did in the meantime when it comes to speaking or other activities. But fast forward to the year I became 24, when I moved to Poland for a year, and that was the first time that I had to use the language in real life because I moved to Poland for an exchange year in my university, and even though Polish spoken in Poland, right? But the university classes were in English. My international friends used English to communicate, so we used English all the time, and that was the first time, right? And the funny part was, unlike many of my Spanish friends, I was actually able to communicate in the language. And all I had done, like I said, was watch the NBA in English for 2 3 hours a day, which is a lot of time, like I said. But what I mean is, I didn't try to learn the rules again, or I didn't try to do anything besides that. Quick side note here is that I remember being or trying to use the language a few times in real life because I'm from a small town in Spain. So I didn't get to use English a lot. It's not like, someone from Madrid or Barcelona. But I do remember trying to use it when I met a Nigerian guy who lived in my city, and I would bump into him sometimes at night. I remember trying to have conversations with them and actually being able to. Also, here you gotta get into the whole drinking alcohol and feeling free thing, but that's another topic. But for the first time, I felt like I could actually use the language. I could actually communicate. I could actually build sentences that made sense in a pretty, how to put it into words, in a pretty fluent way. Meaning that I didn't have to think about it all the time, that it came out pretty spontaneously for the most part, right? But back to the year I became 24 and I came to Poland for the first time. Like, that was such a great feeling. Like, obviously, I already knew because of my conversations, or I remember we had an exam, to not to prepare for this year, but to sort of test our knowledge of English. And there was an oral part, right? And I remember actually being able to talk about things, to communicate in English in that test before coming to Poland, right? Unlike some of my other friends. But the feeling of being able to communicate in the language for kind of the first time, like I said, on a daily basis, was so unbelievable. And even more so coming from that earlier experience that I talked about, which, to be honest, was like 3 years before that, of being completely unable to use the language, like I said. It's just amazing, unbelievable. And of course, there was still a lot of room for improvement. I had to use the language on a daily basis in order to get better. And I'll talk about that in another video, right? But the foundation, the most important thing, I still believe, the one thing that got me there was comprehensible input, obviously. But specifically watching the NBA in English every day for 2 3 hours. And like I said before, I kind of had the hope that it was going to help me out, but I did it because I loved it for the most part, right? So what I want to get into is that in order to be able to communicate in a foreign language, comprehensible input is the most important thing by far. And that's the reason why I'm fluent in English now. And of course, I'm going to keep making mistakes every now and then, like I said. And also from that point, I continue to listen to the language. I do it every day still. I use it on a daily basis. So obviously, I'm trying to remember that was over 10 years ago, right? So I've gotten much better since then. But once again, that was the one thing that helped me get there, right? And also, to be honest, the last 10 years or so that I've been getting better and better, part of it has been actually using the language, but a huge part of it has also been comprehensible input again. Meaning that like I said, I kept listening to English, I kept watching series or other things, the NBA, of course, reading books, and many other things. So even though I use it on a daily basis, like I said, I actually speak the language on a daily basis, which helped me tremendously. Input's still an essential part of it, So if you're looking to learn a foreign language, that's what you got to do. And obviously, depending on your level, again, in my case, like I said, my comprehension was good enough to be able to understand a basketball game. But, if you're starting from scratch, you might have to find specific channels on YouTube that make content adapted to you, to beginners, right? Or you might have to find other easier resources at the beginning and get there eventually. I mean, get to more complex and more interesting resources later on down the road, because you can't start with series or the things that you're most passionate about, but the things that you're not going to be able to understand if you're starting from scratch or even as a beginner, right? So you got to adapt to the level you're at, to your comprehension ability in that moment, right? But that's it, just listen to the language as much as you can. Listen to comprehensible input. Of course, it needs to be comprehensible. Read. And, you see how much your level is going to improve, how much you're going to be able to understand in the language. And it'll start the process of being able to communicate in the language. In another video, I'll talk about things that you can do in order to get better at speaking once you get to that point. But without that first part, without comprehensible input, you're not going to get there. So that's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find it useful. And yeah, let me know in the comments what you think about it and what your experience is with other languages. If you had the same experiences in high school with Spanish, French, German, or other languages, if you can relate to it. And I thank you a lot for getting this far in the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.